So let's have a look at Blaze. Inside of Blaze, we create templates, and templates are basically UI segments. So you can take your HTML and break it down into segments called templates. And to create a template, we basically create a template tag and give it a name. So you give it an attribute name, and you give that the name you want. And then inside of there, you just write standard HTML. And then to include your template inside of your code somewhere, you use the curly braces syntax. So double curly braces, greater than symbol, and then the name of your template, and that'll include your template wherever you put that. And we'll see that in code shortly. I just want to look at a couple of the things we can do inside of templates. The first of which is if statements. So same, we use the double curly braces syntax and hashtag or # if, and you get an if statement. So in this case, we can check if logged in, we write the message welcome back. And if logged in was false, then welcome back would not appear on the page. And similar to if, we have an unless statement, which is the opposite of if. So in this case, if the user is not logged in, we write sign up now. And another thing we get is each, which is a loop, and it'll loop, in this case, through our array of to-dos and print out a to-do template. And Meteor will, or Blaze will automatically give the template the data from the current to-do in our array of to-dos. And we'll see that in code, it'll make more sense. And finally, we can extend our HTML templates using JavaScript, and we get a couple of functions. The first is template.helpers, and that allows us to set up helpers for our templates. And helpers generally provide the template with data. So in here, we'd have a function, say, if we wanted a title for our header, we'd create a function called title, and that would return the value of the header. And then inside our header template, we'd simply print out the title. And template events helps you make your templates dynamic. So let's say you have a button and you want something to happen when we click that button. We set up an event for the button click and some function that'll handle what happens when the button is clicked. So now let's take a look at some code. If you remember, in our first video, we used the Meteor create command to create our first project, which looks like this. It was simply a button, and when you click the button, we can see how many times we've clicked the button. And to see how this actually works, let's dive into the code. So first, let's look at the HTML file, in which we can see that we have a template named hello, and inside of the template, we have a button and a paragraph with the number of times we've clicked the button being printed using a counter variable. So to see how this works, let's check out the hello world.js. And in here we can see we've defined our template helpers using template.hello.helpers, where hello is the name of the template. And inside of here we have a counter, which is a function that returns the current value of the counter gotten from the session. And session in Meteor is a key value store that's reactive. And what that means is basically when the session gets updated, Meteor will automatically update whichever templates rely on the session, based on whichever helpers are using the session. And session has basically two functions. You can get a value and you can set a value. As we can see here, when we click the button, we set the counter to session.get counter value. So we get the current value and we add 1 to it. And session is useful for this kind of stuff where you want to have some data that's stored temporarily for one user. So it won't be sent to the server or anything. It's just for the current session. And it will get cleared out when the user closes the tab or refreshes the page. And we'll be using that for some of our UI components later. So you can see here that we've defined the template events, click button, and when we define events, we first put the action, so in this case click, and the DOM object you want to have that action on, so in this case button. Usually you would have maybe something with a class or an ID, so let's say we want, if we had more than one button on this page, it'd be a problem, because if we clicked any of those buttons, it would run this event, which we might not want. So let's change this, for example, to a class of increment counter. And now if I go to my app, wait for it to refresh, and you'll see now this does nothing. So if we go here and give the button a class of increment counter, now this should work again, and it does. So mostly when you define events, you'll be using either a class or an ID, so that you can control better which elements are calling the events. So let's try and make something a bit more complicated than just a button counter. Let's make a to-do list. So I'm going to start off by clearing out the Meteor code. And before I continue, I just want to talk briefly about this head and body segment. Meteor will automatically find these, doesn't matter which file you define them in. I like to create a main.html file and define them in there. We'll see that in the future, but basically if you want a head and you'll need a body so that you can load your basic template, you can put them anywhere, just as long as you only write them once. So don't create more than one head and more than one body tag, or Meteor will throw an error. So let's start our to-dos list by creating a to-dos template. So to create a template, we just create a template tag, give it a name, and I misspelled template, a name, let's call it to-dos list, and in here we can write our code. And the first thing I'm going to do is change hello to template, because the hello template doesn't, sorry, not template, to-dos list, because our hello template no longer exists. And let's try this out by putting an h3 to-dos, and let's have a look. We can wait for Meteor to refresh. Might be, oh, I have an error. Yes, there we go. So that's a good point. If your Meteor app isn't refreshing as you expect, always check the console and you can see errors. So in this case, I had an error because I misspelled template. So let's see. Now I had to manually refresh, because sometimes when you get an error, Meteor won't be able to refresh the page. Anyway, now it's working. We have our to-dos. And actually, let's remove this. Okay. So now we want to print out a list of to-dos. And to do that, we can use the each helper. So let's say each to-dos. And to end it, you just write and each. And let's just print out a to-do template. So to do that, we write to-do. This will include the to-do template, and of course we need to create the to-do template. So let's create it, to-do, and in here I'm simply going to write out the label. Of course, if we look at our page, we're not going to see anything because we're not providing a list of to-dos to our loop. So to do that, we go to our hello world.js file and create template helpers. So template dot, then we put in our template name, so to-do list dot helpers, and in here we create our helpers. So as I mentioned earlier, here we're looping through to-dos, so we need to name our helper to-dos. And that will be a function which will return a list of to-dos. For now, we're just going to create our own list. So let's give it a label of buy milk. So first to-do, just going to copy that. Let's say get cat food. And let's create a third one. Wash the car. So now, if we have a look at our to-dos, we should see, maybe we have an error. Oh, we have an error again. So I have this error, template is not defined, and that is because I created the template helpers in a file which is run on both the server and the client, and the server does not have the template constant as defined, so I need to wrap this inside of an if statement in which we check if Meteor is client, then we create the helpers. And now let's see, yes, Meteor server restarted, and we have our list of to-dos. So keep in mind that templates can only be defined on the client. And the reason I forgot is because I usually create the template helpers inside of client-only files, and in this case it was a client and server file, so I forgot to add the Meteor is client check. But anyway, back to our to-dos. So now we can see we have a list of to-dos, which is provided by our template helper. Let's quickly make this a little prettier by creating a UL, and then I'm going to create the list items inside of the to-do template itself. So there we go. And as I mentioned before, Blaze is automatically passing the right data to our to-do template each time it loops through to-do. So it'll pass the current to-do, and that's why we can just say label and print it out. Now let's say we wanted to cross out to-dos that we've already completed. And to do that, we're going to use an if statement, and let's create a class of .done in our CSS file, and that's going to add a text decoration of line through. Then in our template, we can say class is equal to, and then the double curly braces syntax, if done, we'll print out done, and end the if statement, and there we go. Let's go back to our to-do helpers, and let's say the first one will be done. And there we go. Now we've crossed out our first to-do. So you can see I simply added a done attribute to our to-do object, and here I'm checking if done is true, then we add the class done, and that's just a label. An important thing to note is that when adding classes dynamically like this, you must add class equals and then do the if statement in here. If you try to do something like this, in which we put the class attribute inside of the if statement, Meteor is going to throw an error because it doesn't like that. And the logic here would be that we only want class to be shown if it's done, because there's only this class. So if it's not done, we don't want an empty class attribute, but you don't need to worry about that because Meteor will automatically remove the class attribute if it's empty. So that's why it works like that. So just remember, always put your if statements inside the brackets and don't inside the quotes, and don't have the attribute name inside of an if statement. That will, it's not just for class, for any attribute, that will always throw an error. So now we have our simple list of to-dos with the first one striked out. And actually, let me show you how unless works. So in this case, I'm going to put unless done, add the class done. So this is just going to reverse this. So these aren't done, but there strike through because I used unless. It's the exact opposite of if, so it basically saves you the trouble of going if not done, which, as you can see, is not going to work because Meteor doesn't like having these special characters in your template helpers. So now let's continue and go back to our proper if statement. Let's say we want to add a to-do to the list. How would we do that? Well, we want to create an event. Let's start by adding a button, and for now we're just going to be adding a generic to-do. We'll look at forms later. So for now we'll just add a to-do with a fixed label. So let's create a button, give it a class of add to-do, and add to-do. So let's have a look. Yep, it doesn't do anything yet. Let's go to our JavaScript file and create the events. Template dot to-dos list dot events, and same with helpers. We pass it an object in which we define keys, which are the event itself. So click, and since I'm using the class, I'm going to put dot add to do, and that returns a function. And now we want to add a to-do to our to-dos list, but because it's in a helper, we've hard-coded it into the helper, we can't exactly do that. So let's take this out of the helper and create a variable up here called to-dos. And now we can say to-dos dot push. And so if you don't know what dot push is, it just adds an element to an array. So in this case, we'll be adding a new to-do. Let's give it a label of new to-do. And just for good measure, I'm going to add a console.log call here, so we can see in the console that we called this, and you'll see why in a second. So let's go back to our browser and wait for me to refresh. Now if I click, you'll see nothing happens. And why is that? Well, let's check our console, and the function was definitely called because it's printing out our add to do console.log, and the reason the to-dos isn't showing up here is because our to-dos var here is not a reactive data source, and Blaze will only update the UI when there are changes to a reactive data source, and primarily that would be either the session object or a collection. So instead of defining our to-dos as a simple variable, let's make it a session variable. So session.set to-dos, and we pass it our array of to-dos, and here we get session.get to-dos, and let's just check that this works. Yes, it does. And now to add a to-do, we need to get the array of to-dos. So our to-dos is equals session.get to-dos to get the current list of to-dos. Then we push a new to-do into that list, and then we need to set the updated list of to-dos. So set to-dos to to-dos. And now we should see this update when we click on add to-dos. Yeah, there we go. So that's the thing to keep in mind, is that Blaze will only update when there's a change to a reactive data source, which includes sessions and collections, and you can actually create your own reactive variables, but we'll see that later in the advanced tutorials. in most cases, we would be using the collection. In this case, it makes no sense to use the session for storing to-dos because, as you can see, if I refresh the page, my to-dos that I added are gone because session is not a persistive storage, so it's just for the current session, and refreshing the page actually clears the session. So you would use session basically just for something like menu is open or things like that that are only for the current user currently acting. You wouldn't really store data in the session. And that's pretty much it for the basics of Blaze. So in the next video, we're going to have a look at collections, and we'll be moving our to-dos to a collection where we can actually do more advanced stuff like adding, updating our to-dos and adding new to-dos with not just a new to-do name.